Hello, and welcome back to season 2 of the podcast series. In today's edition, we are talking drowning and drowning prevention with subject matter expert, Associate Professor Colin Saunders from the Emergency Medicine Division at the University of Cape Town. Professor Saunders, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Wonderful to be here.
So the drowning has become quite a topic of discussion when we look at the global arena. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of what does drowning and drowning prevention currently look like globally?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's an issue that has for a long time been a little bit under-recognized, and people tend to think about drowning as just something that happens at the beach and maybe when you're on holiday or at rivers, but it's much bigger than that. And I think globally, that acceptance of drowning as an under-recognized issue has grown over the last 10 years. The WHO, the World Health Organization, published a global report on drowning in 2014. Yeah. And I think that shocked a lot of people to understand exactly how big the burden is. And that drowning is not some obscure sort of thing that doesn't really happen very often. And since then, we've seen a lot of momentum globally, maybe not locally yet, but certainly globally. And there was a UN resolution on drowning prevention in 2021, and that was followed by a World Health Assembly resolution on accelerating drowning prevention last year. And both of those have triggered a lot of action globally. And I think starting to put it onto political agendas locally as well. So we certainly see growing recognition of drowning as a problem.
From an advocacy perspective.
Yes, yeah.
So one of the things that struck me when I went through the literature is that out of the 16 peer-reviewed systematic reviews that were done, 11 of those published papers come from South Africa.
Yes, so I think you're just referring to there was a systematic review of drowning in Africa.
In Africa,
yeah, and it's interesting. So there has been quite a lot of published work in South Africa, but a lot of it is very small scale. So often it's looking at a very specific. There's one from Red Cross Hospital. They look at quite small data sets and small areas. Right. And a lot of those, I can't remember what the time frame is on that review, but there's quite a lot of old stuff as well. But certainly from the rest of Africa, there's not a lot of evidence around the epidemiology and the burden. It's growing. There's a few countries that are working in the space. Uganda's making good moves, Ghana, Tanzania. But South Africa, it's kind of been on the radar a little bit. But
so do you think that the larger portion of research body of knowledge that is developing, is it indicating that we have a bigger problem?
I think so. What the current trends are telling us is that we actually don't know how big the problem is. I think we, here in South Africa, we have an estimate of about 1,500 drownings, and that's give or take what year and what have you. But about 1,500 fatal drownings every year in South Africa. That number is a little bit contested. So some years it's lower. If you look at the WHO estimates and the global burden of disease estimates for South Africa, it's much higher because they have different modeling, about 2,000 or so. What I think the research is telling us globally, and certainly from a local perspective, is that actually there's a lot that's unaccounted for. We use ICD-10 codes, so the International Classification of Disease, right? And those actually don't really catch drowning as a cause of death very well. So there's a lot of drowning that happens that's pushed into other codes and not actually counted as drowning. Right. And so I think what's happening is we know we kind of have a feel for how many people drown in South Africa. It's too many. But we also know that what the evidence is telling us that there's a lot that is unaccounted for. And the big missing data set as well is the non-fatal drowning. We have so little data and the ability to count non-fatal drownings in South Africa, and globally the average is about 5 non-fatal drownings for every fatal drowning, so that the burden could be up to 5 times bigger than what we're currently looking at if we could measure it.
If we had to translate to help the audience understand the difference between drowning and
Yes.
fatal drowning.
Yes.
From a terminology perspective,
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
it could, to someone it sounds drowning is drowning, but that's
Yes.
not quite what,
Yeah.
what the data is telling us.
And and even if you're in the space and my clinical colleagues and stuff, I still hear people talking about near drowning. So near drowning is a way of talking about non-fatal drowning that we're trying to get rid of. And the reason behind that, and I'll go into the definitions a little bit just now, but the reason behind trying to get away from this near drowning is, and I'll use road traffic injuries as an example, but if you talk about someone who's been in a car crash, we don't say you were in a near car crash, right? You were in a car crash and you were either injured or not injured, or someone might have died.
Right.
But so we talk about the outcome of it, but we count all of those car crashes or the injuries. And so when we talk about near drowning, what happens is people don't think of that as a drowning incident, and we don't count it. And numbers become really important when you're trying to advocate for a problem.
Right.
So we don't talk about near drowning. Many people still do, but we're trying to move away from that. And the official definition of drowning is respiratory impairment. So your airway is impaired because of submersion in a liquid. And then it can have one of two outcomes. So it's three outcomes: fatal, which is you die; non-fatal, and you may have non-fatal with no consequences, and you have non-fatal with severe, a range really of consequences. And that is the terminology that we're trying to move towards, because it allows us to count those non-fatal incidents with no consequences. If they were probably rescued. If they weren't, they could just as easily have been a fatal drowning. And so it's really important when we consider the scale and the burden of drowning and what we're trying to prevent, that those individuals are counted as well. And at the moment in South Africa, they're not, just because we don't know how to. We don't have the data systems to allow us that. It's something that I think we're all trying to grapple with and figure out how we can get those numbers. But it really helps us to understand the whole burden rather than only those that die.
So it's interesting to think about, the measurements of this, and yet it's such an important and a crucial, complex issue within the broader injury prevention space.
Yes.
So when we look at injury, we see drowning as one of the top 5 leading causes of injury and or death in children, specifically
under 5.
Right.
Yes.
So when we look at that larger data set, we also saw, and you need to correct me if I interpret it wrong, that Southern African or African children are 4 times more likely to drown than those in the rest of the world.
So it's I'm not correcting you because I may not have the same thing, but I do know that the rates of drowning in low middle income countries are way higher than high income countries. And I think for the African region in particular, and so it may not, my understanding is not necessarily sub-Saharan, but Southern Africa, but certainly in the African region, the rates are 3 to 4 times higher than that in the rest of the world. Yeah. And I would imagine that may differ slightly by age group, because the one thing that's really clear is that drowning does not look the same in every country in the world. And so globally, sure, children under 5, absolutely the highest category, or the highest rates. But in specific countries, there are, very specific populations of people or groups of people that have much higher risk. And in Uganda, they're seeing it in fishers, so young adult men that are out on the boats, on the lakes. So each country has its nuances as well around the rates.
It's also an interesting thing that pops out from the literature. It seems African men in South Africa is also the largest population affected.
Yeah, and that's an injury thing. I don't know. In South Africa, we see that in almost every injury that we look at. But certainly for drowning, so the rate is about 4 to 1. 4 men drown for every female. Yeah. Right. It's that, and it's actually probably a little bit higher in the adult age groups because it's skewed in the children, it's a much more equal ratio, right? And it's, as you get into the young adult males, that ratio is even higher. Yeah. And I guess a lot of it has to do with behavior and exposure. So, there are differences, unfortunately, as we get older in the kinds of risks that we take and the exposures that we have. But yeah, globally, I think it's men have double the rate of drowning than women, but in South Africa, it's 4 times.
So if let's move on to prevention, specifically looking at children.
Yeah.
And we know that the age category under 5 is most at risk.
Yes.
Or they're most vulnerable. And I want to come back to that misperception that drowning happens at big saltwater or big freshwater bodies. That the danger is actually closer to home than what most may think.
Absolutely.
Let's talk a bit about that.
Yeah, and so the data in South Africa is telling us that about 40% of fatal drowning occurs in children, and that's the broad definition, so up to age of 19,
it's
right?
The bulk.
Yeah, but certainly that 0 to 5 year age group has the highest rates. And it's interesting, there's some evidence out of Australia, so it's actually kind of almost from 1 to 5, because the risk of drowning triples when you turn 1 year old. So even within that 0 to 5 age group, there's actually, it's really when they start toddling around.
Right.
And I have 2 young kids at home. And the word toddler comes from somewhere. They literally toddle around and trip over things and what have you. So, and they're so curious as well. And so we do tend to see that the drowning in that age group happens in and around the home, because that's where they are and that's where their exposure is. We see it in swimming pools. But we also see it in stored water. And there were some unfortunate stories during the drought, the big drought in the Western Cape as well. We tend to counterintuitively think about drought and drowning, but because people were storing water around their homes a lot, and I had buckets of water in my shower and the bath and what have you, there was a lot more unprotected stored water around the home. And we saw, unfortunately, some incidences of young children drowning in a bucket, or even a pond, like a pool of water, and not a swimming pool, but a little storage unit. But yes, so children, that younger age group, they drown in and around the home because that's where their exposure is. And then as we start to move into the older age groups of children, so like 5 to 19, we see drowning shift towards bigger bodies of water. And there it's because obviously they're leaving the home, and they're entering other spaces. And there we see it start to shift towards the bigger open bodies of water.
So when we look at making things safer at home, some of that data also showed, the cisterns, that it's the toilets also that cause the drowning. And it's not something that one would immediately think of as a danger for drowning. So as a mother and as an epidemiologist and an expert on the topic of drowning, what prevention measures would you have for parents?
So I think there's a few. I think the key one, the one that's really, really important, is that, children that young don't understand risk. And we don't always want them to. We want them to adventure and learn about the world and what have you. They are curious by nature. But we have to create an environment that's safe. So they can't do that for themselves. We have to do it as their parents and their caregivers. I have a 20-year history as a lifeguard. Drowning is my interest area. So I consider myself pretty well informed about these things. And my perspectives changed so much when I had children, because I suddenly realized how difficult it is to supervise your kids all the time. And so we talk about supervision. Supervision is key, but it's not only supervision when they're in the swimming pool or in the bath. You have to, the supervision extends to making sure that your home is safe as well. And I often tell people, it sounds strange, but get down on your knees and kind of crawl around your house and see what, maybe don't let anyone see you doing it, but see what, from your toddler's perspective, what water do you come across? Because I think when you start to think at their level and where they are, then
their line of sight.
the bucket of water that's sitting there with stored water, which you don't really see as a risk because it's a bucket. When you start to think of it from their perspective and how easy it is for them to maybe topple into it and then not be able to get out or topple it over. Little ponds. So people think about swimming pool safety, and sometimes they'll put covers and fences, but we forget about little fish ponds and things, which to a toddler is a risk, or a young child. So I think as a parent, supervision is really, really important. So we have to be thinking about how, and this is a thing across most injury types as well, burns, falls, all sorts of things, is who is the responsible adult, the designated responsible adult looking after my child right now. That's really important, but I think we need to build layers of protection, because all of us are, none of us are infallible, put it that way. And we all get tired and distracted, and there's other things, particularly when you have multiple children. And so I think we have to have layers of protection. And those layers look like securing water, putting lids on buckets, closing toilets, making sure that there are covers and fences around swimming pools, and not forgetting about those other little little fish ponds and things. Which is actually a legal
requirement in South Africa.
So you would think so. There are some loose regulations around securing private swimming pools, but if you look at the building regulations as they are now, essentially if you have a boundary wall around your property, you're pretty much covered from a legal requirement. And so there aren't very stringent regulations around protecting your pool. I've been working with the Western Cape Government Disaster Management. There's a group of us that have been working on drafting bylaws for pool safety, so specifically residential pool safety, and we're hoping to get those out for public comment soon. So that would mean that you have to actually secure the perimeter of the pool with either a pool net or a fence, because we've gone to try and make it easy for people. But unfortunately, the regulations and the policy around this at the moment is pretty weak and easy to bypass. So I'm not sure we're going to make many friends, but we're going to try and get that out in the Western Cape at least.
The safety of the child is paramount.
You would hope so.
According to the Constitution.
Yes.
So we have to prioritize
it. Yeah.
As we're heading into the summer months, a whole lot of people is going to head over to the beaches and going to have fun. I mean, is there any lifeguard advice you want to give to people to keep safe?
Sure. So I think there's a few things, and we're very good at this from a road safety perspective. We tell people to do all their, I can't remember how many point checks, but check your tires and brakes and all of that before you go on holiday. And I think that we should give due consideration as well to drowning, water safety. The key one for me is supervision. So if you have children and young children, it's just be present. You're on holiday, you're relaxing, I get it, but you have to put the phone down, whatever. Don't be distracted. Supervise, and particularly young children. I think what often happens when we're on holiday, we might have a very safe home environment, but we go into an Airbnb or a hotel or a friend's home, family's home that is unfamiliar to all of us, and we forget about the safety risks. They may not have young children and they may not have protective measures in place. So I think as soon as you get to where you're going, put your bags down, have a walk around, and just think quickly, where are the risks, and make sure that you can
communicate it to them.
You communicate it to them and mitigate, in some way. Make sure, if there's an unprotected pool, make sure the sliding door is kept closed so that your young kids can't get out there. But that issue of unfamiliar environments, I think, is key. If you're heading to the beach, I think the second thing you need to do is find out where the lifeguards are on duty. So you may be familiar with which beaches are in your area are patrolled. But if you're heading to a different province or something, make sure you find out which beaches are patrolled and swim between the flags. So that's probably one of the key messages around beach safety is find the patrolled beaches. And then, the lifeguards put those big red and yellow flags out every day. And they do that because they find the safest spot on the beach. So even a particularly safe beach might have a rip running on one particular day. So they will put those flags where they are watching and where it's safe to swim. So So definitely swim between the flags. And I think it's just being aware as well. I think it's just general awareness, checking your environment. There are strange environments that you're not used to, and consider the risk. Another one, I mean, we're a couple of months away from holiday season, but the other one that's quite important to me is teaching young children to swim, and at least water safety, so survival swimming. If that's not something you can start now for December, but I think that is an important prevention measure. If you know that your children are going to be exposed, is teach them from, I think the WHO recommends from about age 5. But in South Africa, we often expose them, a lot earlier. And there are certain survival swimming skills before you learn to swim, right? So it's not about learning how to do a swimming race. It's about learning how to float, how to get to the side of the pool. And those things do not drown-proof your child by any means, but they add a layer of protection. And to me, as a parent, it's all about adding layers of protection between your kids and a drowning incident.
Extra minute or two can make a lot
difference. If they can get on their back and float and someone can spot them, that will make a big difference.
Right.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Professor, for sharing your insights.
Absolutely.
If you have enjoyed the content of this video and would like to see more of it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that others in your network can also benefit from the insights gained here today. If you'd like more clinical insight on drowning and drowning prevention, please look into the Season 1 conversation that we had with Professor Heloise Buys, that gives a clinical perspective, including the dangers of secondary drowning. Thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, take care of you and your little ones.
Thank you.